The bitter Wyoming wind cut through the valley like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Silas McCrae stood at the edge of his property line, watching the storm clouds gather over the distant mountains. At 34, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent more time with cattle than people, his face carved by wind and sun into something hard and unyielding. The locals in Mercy's Bend called him the Heartless Rancher, though none dared say it to his face. His ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of harsh beauty, where sagebrush fought for space with hardy grass and the occasional stubborn wildflower. The main house stood like a fortress against the elements, solid timber walls, small windows, and a roof pitched sharp enough to shed the heavy snows. Inside, it was as Spartan as the man himself. A single chair by the fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. No pictures, no softness, nothing that might remind him of what life could have been. Silas worked from before dawn until well after dark, losing himself in the endless rhythm of ranch life. He mended fences with methodical precision, tended to sick cattle with surprising gentleness, and rode the boundaries of his land like a man possessed. The work kept the memories at bay, most days. Anyway, but in the long winter nights, when the wind howled through the eaves and the fire burned low, the ghosts always found him. It had been 10 years since Thomas died, 10 years since his younger brother had been accused of cattle theft by the wealthy Garrison family, 10 years since a lynch mob had taken justice into their own hands, stringing Thomas up from the old cottonwood tree by Miller's Creek before anyone could prove his innocence. Silas had been away, driving cattle to market in Cheyenne. He'd returned to find his brother's body and a town full of people who suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. The evidence of Thomas's innocence had surfaced a week later, the real thief caught red-handed with the Garrison brand still smoking in his hand. But by then, Thomas was cold in the ground, and the men who'd killed him had melted back into the landscape like smoke. The law, such as it was in those days, shrugged its shoulders and moved on. Silas had learned his lesson well. Justice was a luxury the West couldn't afford, and a man could only count on himself. On this particular November morning, as frost painted the grass white and his breath clouded in the air, Silas noticed smoke rising from the old Hadley place. The cabin had stood empty for 3 years, ever since old man Hadley had died of pneumonia. It sat just beyond his eastern boundary, a modest structure that had seen better days. Silas frowned. He'd grown accustomed to his isolation, had built his life around it. Neighbors meant complications. In town that afternoon, loading supplies onto his wagon, Silas heard the gossip before he saw her. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, held court outside the general store, her voice carrying like a crow's caw. "A widow from back east," she announced to her eager audience. "Arrived on yesterday's stage with barely more than the clothes on her back. Rented the Hadley place sight unseen. Margaret Whitley, she calls herself. Pretty enough, I suppose, if you like that refined type, but mark my words, there's a story there. No respectable woman travels alone to Wyoming territory." Silas hefted a sack of flour into his wagon, pretending not to listen. But Jake Morrison, the store owner's son, wasn't content to let him be. "Hey, McCrae," Jake called out, a smirk playing at his lips. "Looks like you got yourself a neighbor. Maybe she'll civilize you some." Silas fixed the younger man with a stare that could freeze water. "Mind your own business, boy." Jake's smirk faltered, and he found sudden interest in arranging the pickle barrels. Silas finished loading his supplies in blessed silence, but his mind kept circling back to the smoke from the Hadley place. A widow. From the east. It was none of his concern. The first time he saw Margaret Whitley, she was standing in the doorway of the cabin, wrestling with a stubborn door that had swollen shut with autumn rain. She wore a practical gray dress that had seen better days, and her dark hair was pinned up in a style that was fighting a losing battle with the Wyoming wind. She must have sensed his presence because she turned, and their eyes met across the 50 yards that separated their properties. Silas had expected fear. Most people looked at him with wariness or outright hostility. But Margaret Whitley's green eyes held only polite curiosity. She offered a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned back to her battle with the door as if encountering a strange man in the middle of nowhere was perfectly ordinary. He should have ridden on, should have minded his own business as he'd told Jake Morrison to do. Instead, Silas found himself dismounting and walking toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the frost-brittle grass. "Door's been stuck since the last rain," he said by way of greeting. "Needs the bottom edge planed down." Margaret Whitley straightened, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 27 or 28, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. "I see," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Boston breeding. "I don't suppose you know where I might find someone to do such work. I've got tools." The words were out before he could stop them. Silas McCrae didn't help people. He didn't involve himself in others' troubles, but something about the way she stood there, straight-backed and determined despite the obvious challenges, reminded him of... No, he wouldn't think about that. "I wouldn't want to impose," she said carefully, studying his face. "I'm sure you have your own work to tend to. Won't take but a few minutes." And that was how Silas found himself kneeling in Margaret Whitley's doorway, plane in hand, shaving careful curls of wood from the swollen door. She hovered nearby, not quite wringing her hands, but clearly uncertain about the protocol of having a stranger, a male stranger, working on her home. "I'm Margaret Whitley," she offered after a moment. "Though I suppose you already know that. News travels fast in small towns." Silas grunted in acknowledgement, focused on his work. "And you're Mr. McCrae, the rancher." Another grunt. "I want to thank you for this. I'm afraid I'm not quite prepared for the rustic nature of Western living." Something in her voice, a hint of self-deprecating humor, made him look up. She was smiling slightly, as if sharing a private joke with herself. "Wyoming's not for everyone," he said, returning to his work. "No," she agreed quietly. But then, neither was Boston. The door swung freely now, and Silas stood, brushing wood shavings from his pants. He was preparing to leave when the smell of smoke hit him, not the pleasant smoke of a well-tended fire, but the acrid scent of something burning. "Oh no!" Margaret rushed past him into the cabin. Silas followed without thinking and found her yanking a smoking pot off the small stove, coughing as black smoke filled the tiny kitchen. He crossed to the window, forcing it open despite the protesting hinges, then opened the door wide to create a cross breeze. Margaret stood in the middle of the chaos, holding the ruined pot with the expression of such utter defeat that something twisted in Silas's chest. "I was trying to make coffee," she said, then laughed, a sound both bitter and genuinely amused. "I've managed to burn water. That must be some sort of achievement." "Stove's tricky," Silas heard himself say. "Damper's loose. Pull it too far and it burns too hot." He showed her the proper setting, helped her clean the pot, and before he quite knew what was happening, he was sitting at her small table while she successfully brewed a pot of coffee. The cabin's interior surprised him. Despite its modest size and obvious need for repairs, she'd already made it welcoming. A colorful quilt covered the narrow bed, books lined a makeshift shelf, and a small watercolor of what looked like a New England garden hung on the wall. "It's not much," she said, following his gaze. "But it's mine." There was something in the way she said it, a fierce pride mixed with relief, that made him wonder what she was running from. But Silas McCrae didn't ask personal questions, just as he didn't answer them. They drank their coffee in surprisingly comfortable silence. Margaret didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with chatter, which he appreciated. When he finally rose to leave, she walked him to the door. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae, for the door and the stove, and, well, for not letting me burn the place down on my second day." "Silas," he said gruffly. "Name Silas." "Thank you, Silas." He'd ridden halfway home before he realized it was the first time in years anyone had made him coffee. The first time in even longer that he'd wanted to turn around and go back. That night, as snow began to fall in earnest, Silas stood at his window looking east toward the Hadley place. A warm light glowed in the windows, a small beacon against the darkness. For 10 years, he'd chosen isolation, worn it like armor against a world that had proven itself cruel and unjust. But something about Margaret Whitley, her quiet strength, her unexpected humor in the face of adversity, the way she'd looked at him like he was just a man and not a local legend, had slipped past his defenses. He turned away from the window, banking the fire for the night. Tomorrow he had fences to mend and cattle to tend. Tomorrow he would return to his solitary routine and forget about green eyes and burned coffee. But as he lay in his narrow bed, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, Silas found himself thinking about loose stove dampers and doors that needed fixing, and wondering if Margaret Whitley knew how to prepare for a Wyoming winter. It was only neighborly to check, he told himself. Only practical. In the darkness, his brother's ghost seemed to laugh. The first heavy snow came 3 days later, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Silas had spent the morning moving his cattle to lower pastures, knowing from experience that this early storm was just a preview of the harsh winter ahead. As he rode back toward his ranch, he couldn't help but glance toward the Hadley place. No smoke rose from the chimney. He told himself it wasn't his business. Margaret Whitley was a grown woman who'd chosen to come west. If she couldn't manage a simple fire, that was her problem, but his horse seemed to have other ideas. Turning east without prompting, he found her outside, wrapped in a thin shawl, struggling with an armload of wet firewood. Snow had already soaked through her boots, and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. "That wood won't burn," he said without preamble. "Too green, and now it's wet besides." Margaret looked up, startled. Snow clung to her dark lashes, and her cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion. "Mr. McCrae, Silas, I didn't hear you approach." "Where's your winter wood?" She gestured helplessly toward a small pile near the cabin. "Mr. Morrison said this would last through winter." Silas dismounted and examined the pile. Half-rotted pine, mostly, with a few pieces of green aspen mixed in. Barely enough to last 2 weeks, let alone a Wyoming winter. His jaw tightened. Jake Morrison had sold her garbage, probably at premium prices. "Get inside," he ordered. "You're half frozen." "But the fire—" "I'll handle it. Go." For once, she didn't argue. Silas retrieved dry kindling from his saddlebags. He always carried some in winter, and soon had a proper fire crackling in her stove. While the cabin warmed, he made a mental inventory of everything else she'd need. Proper firewood, of course, but also weather stripping for the windows, a better water barrel, warmer clothes. "You can't stay here," he said abruptly. "Not through winter. Not like this." Margaret's spine stiffened. "I beg your pardon. This cabin's not fit for winter living. Gaps in the walls, insufficient heat, barely any supplies. First real blizzard will freeze you solid. Then I'll learn to manage better." Her green eyes flashed with determination. "I didn't come all this way to give up at the first snowfall. This isn't about giving up. It's about surviving." "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. McCrae." He studied her for a long moment, the delicate hands now reddened with cold, the Eastern clothes wholly unsuited for frontier life, the stubborn set of her chin. "Maybe so, but tough doesn't keep you warm when it's 20 below. Then perhaps you could teach me what I need to know." The request caught him off guard. People in Mercy's Bend didn't ask Silas McCrae for help. They whispered about him, feared him, avoided him when possible. But Margaret Whitley stood there in her inadequate shawl and wet boots, looking at him with those direct green eyes as if he were just another neighbor she might call upon for advice. "I'll pay you, of course," she added quickly, misinterpreting his silence. "I have some money saved." "Keep your money," he growled. "I'll bring proper firewood tomorrow, and supplies for the gaps." Before she could respond, he was out the door and mounted on his horse. He didn't look back, didn't see the way she stood in the doorway watching him ride away, a puzzled smile playing at her lips. True to his word. Silas returned the next morning with a wagon full of seasoned hardwood. He'd risen even earlier than usual, telling himself it was only practical to help her now rather than find a frozen corpse come spring. The lie sat uneasily, but he clung to it anyway. Margaret emerged from the cabin as he began unloading, dressed in the same thin dress but with a determined cheerfulness that seemed to defy the cold. "Good morning," she called. "I've made coffee, properly this time, I promise." He grunted an acknowledgement, focusing on stacking the wood against the cabin's north wall where it would be protected from the worst of the weather. She disappeared inside and returned with 2 steaming cups. "Black," she said, offering him one. "I noticed that's how you took it before." The coffee was good, better than good, rich and strong, with no hint of burning. He found himself taking a second sip, then a third. "My husband always said I made excellent coffee," Margaret said quietly. It was one of the few domestic skills I possessed that he approved of. It was the first time she'd mentioned a husband. Silas kept stacking wood, but he was listening. "He died 2 years ago," she continued, as if he'd asked. "A carriage accident in Boston. Very sudden. His family felt I should have done more to prevent it, though I'm not sure how one prevents a spooked horse in a patch of ice. Families need someone to blame." Silas heard himself say, "Makes the loss easier to bear." She looked at him with surprise and something else, understanding. Perhaps. Yes, I suppose that's true. They worked in companionable silence after that, Margaret helping despite his protests. She learned quickly, watching how he stacked the wood for maximum airflow and protection. When they finished, the pile stood tall and neat against the cabin wall, enough to last through March if she was careful. "Now the windows," Silas said, retrieving tools and strips of cloth from his wagon. He showed her how to find the gaps where cold air snuck through, how to pack them with cloth and seal them with a mixture of mud and straw. Margaret proved surprisingly adept with her hands, following his instructions without complaint, even when the work grew tedious. "You're not what I expected," she said as they worked on the last window. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. The people in town speak of you in whispers. The heartless rancher. They call you someone to be feared." His hands stilled on the window frame. "They're not wrong, aren't they?" She tilted her head, studying him with those discerning eyes. A heartless man wouldn't spend his day teaching a foolish Eastern woman how to survive winter. "Practical, not kind," he corrected. "Can't have you freezing to death on my border. Bad for property values." Margaret laughed then, not the bitter sound from that first day, but something bright and genuine that seemed to fill the small cabin. The sound startled him so much he nearly dropped his hammer. "Of course," she said, eyes dancing with mirth. "How thoughtless of me to threaten your property values with my potential demise." Against his will. Silas felt his lips twitch. Not quite a smile, but closer than he'd come in years. The work finished. He began gathering his tools. Margaret disappeared into the cabin and returned with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Fresh bread," she said, pressing it into his hands. "I may not know much about frontier living yet, but I do know how to bake." The bread was still warm, its smell making his stomach growl. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had fresh-baked anything. "Thank you," he managed. "It's the least I can do. You've been very generous with your time and supplies." He wanted to leave then, to retreat to the safety of his solitary ranch, but something made him linger. "You'll need warmer clothes," he said. "That shawl won't do when the real cold comes." "I'll manage. There's a trunk in my attic," he found himself saying. "Belonged to my mother. Might be something useful in there." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she only nodded. "That's very kind." "Practical," he insisted, but the word sounded weak even to his ears. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Silas would find reasons to check on the eastern border of his property, which naturally led past the Hadley cabin. If Margaret happened to be outside, he'd stop to ensure she had what she needed. If she invited him in for coffee, well, it would be rude to refuse. She always had coffee ready, as if she'd been expecting him. and fresh bread, or soup, or on one memorable occasion, a pie made from preserved apples she'd found in the root cellar. "My grandmother's recipe," she said, watching anxiously as he took the first bite. "Though I had to substitute a few ingredients." The pie was perfect, tart and sweet, with a crust that flaked like golden leaves. Silas ate 2 slices while Margaret regaled him with stories of her grandmother, a formidable woman who'd run a boarding house in Boston's rougher districts. "She's the one who taught me to bake," Margaret said. "Said a woman should have at least one skill that could keep her fed, no matter what life threw at her. Wise woman. I think she would have liked Wyoming. She always said Boston society was too restrictive, too concerned with appearances." These glimpses into her past came in fragments, like puzzle pieces scattered across their conversations. Her husband had been older, a banker with old family money. The marriage had been arranged by her parents when she was barely 18. Not unhappy, exactly, but not the love match she'd dreamed of as a girl. "He wasn't unkind," she said one snowy afternoon, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "Just distant. I was more like a piece of furniture than a wife. Something to complete the proper picture of his life." Silas understood that feeling, being seen as something other than human. In his case, it was the town's fear that reduced him to a caricature. In hers, it had been her husband's indifference. The people of Mercy's Bend noticed their tentative friendship. Of course, nothing stayed secret long in a small town. Mrs. Patterson made sure of that. "Quite cozy, those two," she announced at the general store one day, loud enough for Silas to hear from the feed section. "That Eastern widow certainly worked fast, though what she sees in that brute is beyond me." "Maybe she's after his land," suggested Mrs. Garrett. "You know how these Eastern women are, all calculation beneath the pretty faces." Silas's hands clenched on the feed sack, but he forced himself to continue his shopping. Their words shouldn't matter. He'd endured worse over the years. But 2 days later, when he encountered Margaret at the store, he saw how the whispers had affected her. She stood straighter, her chin lifted in defiance, but hurt flickered in her eyes when Mrs. Patterson deliberately turned away from her greeting. "Mrs. Whitley," Jake Morrison called from behind the counter, his tone oily with false friendliness. "Find everything you need? I'd be happy to help a lovely widow with her selections." The implication in his voice was clear. Margaret's cheeks flushed, but she maintained her dignity. "Just these items. Thank you." Morrison named a price nearly double what the goods were worth. Margaret opened her purse without complaint, but Silas had heard enough. "That's 30 cents too high, Morrison," he said, stepping from behind the feed display. The store went silent. Morrison's face paled slightly, but he tried to maintain his bravado. "Don't believe I was talking to you. McCrae. No, you were trying to cheat Mrs. Whitley." Silas moved closer, noting with satisfaction how Morrison took an involuntary step back. "Correct the price. Now see here. The price, Morrison. Unless you'd like everyone to know exactly what you've been adding to your scale weights." Morrison's face went from pale to red. Everyone knew he skimmed a bit here and there, but proving it was another matter. "Unless, of course, you were Silas McCrae and had caught him in the act years ago." "Mistake," Morrison muttered, adjusting the total. "Simple mistake." Margaret paid the correct amount and gathered her purchases. Silas followed her outside, where she turned to face him. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly. "I can fight my own battles." "I know you can. Doesn't mean you should have to." She studied him for a long moment, snow beginning to dust her dark hair. "They'll talk more now, about us. Let them talk. It doesn't bother you." He thought about it, really considered her question. For 10 years, he'd lived with the town's whispers and fears, building walls so high and thick that nothing could penetrate. But somehow, this slip of an Eastern woman with her warm coffee and unexpected laughter had found a crack in his defenses. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't." Margaret smiled then, not the polite society smile she wore like armor, but something genuine and warm that transformed her face. In that case, Mr. McCrae, would you like to come for supper tomorrow? I'm attempting roast beef, and I could use an honest opinion on whether it's edible. Silas, he reminded her. And yes, as he rode home through the gathering snow, Silas realized the truth that had been creeping up on him for weeks. The sound he looked forward to most wasn't the morning coffee brewing or the warm greeting when he approached her cabin. It was Margaret's laughter, bright and unexpected, thawing something in him he'd thought frozen forever. For the first time in 10 years, the ghost seemed quieter, and the empty ranch house felt less like a fortress and more like what it truly was, a lonely man's cage. Waiting for someone to turn the key, the roast beef was perfectly edible, much to Margaret's relief. They ate at her small table, the oil lamp casting a warm glow that pushed back the winter darkness pressing against the windows. Outside, snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, muffling all sound until it seemed they were the only two people in the world. "You're not eating much," Margaret observed, watching Silas push food around his plate. "It's good," he assured her quickly. "Just not used to this proper meals. Company?" She smiled softly. "I understand. I ate alone for most of my marriage. Charles had his club, his business dinners. I had the servants, but that's not really company. Is it?" "No," Silas agreed. "It's not." They finished the meal in comfortable quiet, but Margaret seemed restless. She cleared the dishes with quick, nervous movements, then returned to the table with a bottle of whiskey he recognized from Morrison's store. The good stuff, not the rot gut most folks drank. "Would you like some?" she offered. "I bought it for medicinal purposes, but I think tonight qualifies." He nodded, and she poured 2 generous measures. The whiskey burned warm down his throat, loosening something that had been wound tight for years. "Tell me about your brother," Margaret said suddenly, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." "Thomas," Silas interrupted, surprising himself. His name was Thomas. She waited, patient as always, while he gathered words he'd never spoken aloud. He was 23, smart as a whip, always reading when he should have been working cattle. Had this idea about becoming a teacher, maybe even a lawyer someday. The whiskey made the words come easier. "I was saving money to send him to school back east. Nearly had enough, too." "What happened?" "The Garrison family lost some cattle, valuable breeding stock. They found one of our branding irons near where the fence was cut." Silas stared into his glass. "Thomas was the only one unaccounted for that night. I was in Cheyenne, and our 2 hands were in town at the saloon with plenty of witnesses. But he didn't do it. No. Thomas wouldn't steal a crumb of bread if he was starving. But the Garrisons had influence, and folks were scared of rustlers. They worked everyone into a frenzy." His hands tightened on the glass. "By the time they found him, it was too late for trials or truth." Margaret reached across the table, her fingers barely brushing his clenched fist. "How did you find out he was innocent?" "Real thief got greedy, tried to steal from the wrong ranch, got caught with a running iron that matched the cuts on the Garrison fence, confessed to the whole thing when they threatened to hang him." Silas laughed bitterly. "He's in prison now. 5 years for cattle theft. Thomas got death for the same crime he didn't commit. And the men who killed him disappeared like smoke. Oh, I knew who some of them were. Could see it in their eyes every time I went to town. But knowing and proving are different things, and the law wasn't interested in pursuing it." Margaret's fingers curled around his fist, warm and steady. "So you stayed. Why?" It was a question he'd asked himself 1,000 times. "Where would I go? This land is all I know, and maybe I stayed because leaving felt like letting them win. Like admitting Thomas died for nothing." "He didn't die for nothing," Margaret said firmly. "He died because small, frightened people did a terrible thing. That's their shame to carry, not yours." "Is it?" Silas pulled his hand away, standing abruptly. "I should have been here, should have protected him." "You were working to give him a future. That's love. Silas, not failure. The kindness in her voice nearly undid him. He moved to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. Behind him, he heard Margaret rise, heard the whisper of her skirts as she approached. "I lost a child," she said quietly. "A daughter. She lived 3 days." Silas turned to find her standing close, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "Charles blamed me, said I'd been too active during my confinement, hadn't followed the doctor's orders precisely. His mother agreed. After all, women in their family had healthy babies. It must have been my failing. Margaret, I believed them for a long time, carried that guilt like stones in my chest, but guilt didn't bring her back, and it didn't make me a better person. It just made me hollow." She wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "When Charles died, his family wanted to keep me in that hollowness. Their grief needed a target, and I was convenient. That's why I left. Not because I stopped loving my daughter or stopped grieving Charles, but because I couldn't let their pain define my life anymore." They stood facing each other in the lamplight, two souls carved by loss, recognizing something fundamental in each other. "What was her name?" Silas asked softly. "Your daughter?" "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Rose." Margaret smiled through her tears. "The nurse said she was beautiful. Perfect little fingers and toes." Without conscious thought, Silas reached out, thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. Margaret's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibilities and dangers. "I should go," Silas said roughly, but he didn't move. "Should you?" Her eyes were so green, like spring grass after rain. When had he moved closer? When had his hand shifted to cup her face? Margaret's lips parted slightly, and he could feel her warm breath against his skin. The kiss was inevitable as sunrise, soft at first, almost questioning, then deeper as years of loneliness crashed over them both. Margaret's hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring him, while he pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. She tasted of whiskey and tears and something essentially Margaret, warmth and light and home. Reality crashed back like cold water. Silas jerked away, breathing hard. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have." "Why?" Margaret's eyes blazed with something fierce. "Because the town gossips will talk? Because I'm a widow who should be properly mourning? Because you've decided you don't deserve happiness? You don't understand, don't I?" She stepped closer, and he backed away until he hit the wall. "We're not dead. Silas, Thomas is gone, Elizabeth is gone, Charles is gone, but we're still here. Doesn't that mean something?" "It means we survived, that's all." "That's everything." Her voice broke on the words. "Do you know how hard it is to keep breathing when the world goes dark? To get up each morning and pretend to be whole when you're shattered inside? We survived. Silas McCrae. And that's not nothing. That's a miracle." He wanted to argue, to explain why she was wrong, why letting her close was dangerous for them both, but she was looking at him with those impossible green eyes, and he was so tired of being cold. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Neither do I," Margaret said. "But maybe we can learn together." The storm picked up outside, wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. They should talk about what had happened, what it meant, where it might lead. Instead, they returned to the table, to the whiskey and the lamplight, and talked of safer things. Books Margaret had loved, places Silas had seen on his cattle drives, dreams they'd put aside so long ago they'd almost forgotten them. "I wanted to be a teacher too," Silas confessed as the whiskey bottle emptied. "Before I inherited the ranch, Thomas and I used to joke about it. Two McCrae boys with more interest in books than cattle. You still could be. Too late for that." "Is it?" Margaret challenged. "There are children in town who need schooling. The current teacher is overwhelmed and undertrained. The town wouldn't accept me teaching their children. You know that. The town didn't accept me either. Yet here we are." As the hour grew late, Silas knew he should leave. The storm had worsened, but he'd ridden through worse. Yet something kept him in his chair. Some invisible tether between him and the woman across the table. "You can't ride in this," Margaret said, reading his thoughts. "The temperature's dropping, and visibility is nearly zero. I've managed worse." "I'm sure you have, but there's no need to risk it tonight." She stood, wrapping her shawl tighter. "You can sleep by the fire. I have extra blankets." Every rational part of him said to leave. Staying would only fuel the gossip, compromise her reputation further, but Margaret was already gathering blankets from a trunk, humming softly under her breath, and the warmth of the cabin was so much better than the cold. Empty ranch house waiting for him. "Just tonight," he said. She smiled, that knowing look that said she heard what he wasn't saying. "Of course, just tonight." They prepared for sleep with careful propriety, Margaret behind the curtain that separated her sleeping area, Silas arranging blankets by the fire. But the intimacy of the situation hung between them like a physical presence. Every rustle of fabric, every creak of the floorboards, seemed magnified in the darkness. "Silas?" Margaret's voice came soft from behind the curtain. "Yeah. Thank you for staying." He stared at the fire, watching shadows dance on the walls. "Thank you for asking me to." Sleep eluded him for a long time. He lay listening to the storm, to the occasional sound of Margaret shifting in her bed, to the voices in his head warning him about the dangerous path he was walking. But louder than all of that was the memory of her kiss, the feel of her in his arms, the way she'd said his name like it was something precious. Near dawn, the storm finally quieted. Silas rose silently, folding the blankets with military precision. He should leave before she woke, before they had to navigate the awkwardness of morning after a night that had changed everything and nothing. But Margaret was already up, standing by the stove in her wrapper, heating coffee. "Running away?" she asked without turning. "Going home. Same thing, sometimes." She poured 2 cups, handed him one. "We can pretend last night didn't happen, if that's what you need. Go back to careful visits and proper distance. Is that what you want?" She turned then, meeting his eyes squarely. "No. But I've learned that what I want and what I can have are rarely the same thing." "Margaret, I know all the reasons this is impossible," she interrupted. "I know the town sees me as a calculating widow, and you as a dangerous recluse. I know we're both carrying ghosts that won't rest easy. I know 100 reasons why we should keep that door closed." She set down her cup, stepped closer. "But I also know that you make me laugh, that you look at me like I'm real, not just a role to play, that for the first time in years, I don't feel hollow." Silas set down his own cup, his hands shaking slightly. "I don't know how to be what you need. I don't need you to be anything but yourself. That might not be enough. Let me decide that." He kissed her then, in the soft dawn light with snow still falling outside. Kissed her like a drowning man reaching for shore, like a prayer and a promise and an admission of defeat all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Silas knew there was no going back. "This won't be easy," he warned. Margaret laughed, that bright sound he'd grown to crave. "Nothing worth having ever is." As he rode home through the fresh snow, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in a decade. Hope. It terrified him more than all the ghosts and gossip combined, but for the first time since Thomas died, he thought maybe Margaret was right. They had survived the darkness. Maybe that did mean something. Maybe that was everything. The weeks following that snowy night passed in a strange dance of advance and retreat. Silas found himself drawn to Margaret's cabin like a moth to flame. Yet each visit left him more unsettled. The ease between them felt dangerous, too much like the life he'd sworn he'd never allow himself again. So he began to pull back, letting days pass between visits, keeping their conversations carefully neutral. Margaret noticed, of course. She was too perceptive not to see his withdrawal, but she didn't push. She simply welcomed him when he came, served coffee, shared small talk about the weather and her preparations for deeper winter. If hurt flickered in her green eyes when he cut visits short or declined her invitations to stay for meals, she hid it well. The town, however, was less subtle in its reactions. "That Eastern woman's gotten above herself. Mrs." Patterson announced loudly at Sunday service, ensuring Margaret could hear from her pew. "Acting like she belongs here, trying to sink her hooks into poor Mr. McCrae." "Poor Mr. McCrae?" scoffed Mrs. Garrett. "That man's got ice for blood, though I suppose even ice melts if you apply enough heat." The implications in their voices made Margaret's cheeks burn, but she kept her head high, her attention fixed on Reverend Davidson's sermon about compassion and understanding. Silas wasn't at service. He never was. But somehow his absence made the whispers worse. Later that week, Margaret encountered worse than whispers. She'd gone to town for supplies, bundled against the bitter cold in the thick coat Silas had found in his mother's trunk. 3 young men loitered outside the saloon, already drunk despite the early hour. "Well, well," said Sam Henley, the banker's nephew. "The Merry Widow's looking fine today." Margaret tried to pass, but they spread out, blocking her path. "Heard you've been keeping McCrae warm at night," added Joe Tillman, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Must be true what they say about widow women, always hungry for company." "Please let me pass," Margaret said quietly, clutching her parcels. "Now don't be unfriendly." Sam moved closer, reaching for her arm. "Maybe you should spread that warmth around. McCrae can't be much fun, cold as he is." Margaret jerked away, but Joe grabbed her parcels, spilling flour and beans across the muddy ground. "Oops, clumsy me. Better get down and clean that up, hadn't you?" "That's enough." The voice cut through the cold air like a blade. Silas stood 10 feet away, his hand resting on his gun belt, face carved from stone. The 3 men sobered slightly, but alcohol made them bold. "Just having some fun. McCrae," Sam said. "No harm meant. Pick up the lady's supplies. Now see here." Silas moved so fast Sam barely saw it coming. One moment he was standing. The next he was face down in the mud, Silas's boot on his neck. "I said, pick them up." Joe and the 3rd man scrambled to gather the spilled goods, while Sam gasped and struggled in the mud. Silas didn't move until every item was collected and placed carefully in Margaret's arms. "Apologize," Silas ordered, releasing Sam. The younger man stumbled to his feet, mud coating his expensive clothes. His face was purple with rage and humiliation. "I'll see you hang for this. McCrae, just like your thieving brother." The punch knocked Sam flat again. This time he didn't get up, just lay groaning in the mud. Joe and his friend dragged him away, casting fearful glances back at Silas. "Are you hurt?" Silas asked Margaret, his voice gentler but still tight with anger. "No, thank you. Get in the wagon. I'll drive you home." The ride back was silent. Margaret could feel the fury radiating from Silas, see it in his white-knuckled grip on the reins. When they reached her cabin, he helped her down and carried her supplies inside, all without a word. "Silas," she began. "This is why," he exploded, pacing her small cabin like a caged wolf. "This is exactly why I should stay away from you. They'll never let you be now. It'll only get worse. That wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" He rounded on her, eyes blazing. "You think they'd have bothered you if you weren't associated with me? You were managing fine before I complicated things." "Managing?" Margaret's own temper flared. "Is that what you think I want? To manage? To exist quietly on the edges while those small-minded fools dictate how I should live? It's better than being a target." "No, it's not." She stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated by his anger. "I've been a target before. Silas, in Boston. I was the wife who couldn't give her husband an heir, the woman who failed at her only purpose. At least here. I'm a target for something I chose. You don't know what you're choosing. The town barely tolerates me. They'll destroy you for standing with me. Then let them try." Her chin lifted defiantly. "I've survived worse than small-town gossip. Have you survived violence? Because that's where this leads. Sam Henley won't forget what happened today, neither will his uncle. They have influence. Margaret, They could run you out of town, burn you out, like they did your brother. The words hung between them like a slap. Silas went very still. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly. That was cruel. It was true. His voice was flat, empty. "And that's exactly my point. I couldn't protect Thomas. What makes you think I can protect you? I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you not to abandon me because you're afraid." "I'm not afraid." "Aren't you?" She caught his arm as he turned to leave. "You're terrified. Not of Sam Henley or the town gossips, but of this, of us, of feeling something again after being numb for so long." He jerked away. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? You think you're the only one who's scared? Every time I laugh at something you say, every time I catch myself watching for you through the window, every time my heart speeds up when I hear your horse approaching, it terrifies me. Because I swore I'd never let anyone have that power over me again. I swore I'd never be vulnerable to another person's choices. Then you understand why this has to stop." "No, I understand why we're perfect for each other. We're both so scared of being hurt again that we've forgotten what it feels like to truly live." Silas stood with his hand on the door, shoulders rigid with tension. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I won't watch someone else I care about get destroyed because of me." He left before she could respond, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Margaret stood in her empty cabin, fighting tears of frustration and hurt. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers trying to get in. Days passed with no word from Silas. Margaret went about her routines, tending her small vegetable garden in the cold frame, baking bread, reading by lamplight. But everything felt hollow. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet comfort of sharing space with someone who understood loss. The absence of him was like a missing tooth her tongue kept finding. A week after the incident in town, she decided she'd had enough of his self-imposed martyrdom. She saddled the gentle mare she'd recently purchased and rode to his ranch, her jaw set with determination. She found him in the barn, mending tack with a single-minded focus. He looked up at her entrance, and she saw the war in his eyes, joy at seeing her battling with determination to push her away. "Margaret, you shouldn't be here." "Probably not." She moved into the barn, noting how he tensed with each step she took. "But then, I've made a habit of being places I shouldn't be. It's quite liberating, actually. I'm serious. So am I." She stopped just out of arm's reach. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being able to protect me. Margaret, you were right. You can't protect me, just like I can't protect you. We're all walking around with targets on our backs. Silas, life has excellent aim, and it doesn't miss. The question is whether we face it alone or together." He set down the bridle he'd been working on, his hands clenched. "Together makes the target bigger. Together makes us stronger. Thomas had me, didn't make him stronger, didn't save him. No, it didn't. But would you trade the years you had with him? Would you choose never to have loved him to spare yourself the pain of losing him?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He sank onto a hay bale, suddenly looking every one of his 34 years. "That's not fair," he said hoarsely. "Love isn't fair. It's risky and painful and absolutely unfair. But the alternative—" She moved closer, kneeling in the hay beside him. "The alternative is this half-life we've both been living. Is that really better?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and Margaret saw everything in his eyes, the want, the fear, the bone-deep loneliness that matched her own. "I don't know how to let go," he admitted, "of the anger, the guilt. It's been part of me for so long." "I'm not asking you to let go. I'm asking you to let me in. There's room for both. Silas, the grief and the joy, the past and the possibility of a future. The town, we'll talk regardless. At least give them something worth gossiping about." Despite himself, Silas felt his lips twitch. "That's a dangerous philosophy. Mrs. Whitley." "I'm a dangerous woman. Mr. McCrae, I thought you'd figured that out by now." He reached out, fingers ghosting over her cheek. "Yeah, I'm beginning to see that." She caught his hand, pressed it firmly against her face. "So what are we going to do about it?" For a long moment, they stayed frozen in that tableau, two damaged souls reaching across the divide of loss and fear. Then Silas pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I don't know," he said roughly, "but I'm tired of running from it." Margaret held him tightly, feeling the tremors that ran through his solid frame. "Then stop running. Stay. Fight for this with me. The town won't make it easy." "When has anything worthwhile been easy?" He pulled back to look at her, and Margaret saw something new in his expression, not just want or fear, but a tentative hope. "You're sure?" he asked. Instead of answering with words, she kissed him. Not the desperate, passion-driven kisses they'd shared before, but something deeper, a promise, a choice, a declaration that whatever came next, they'd face it together. When they finally broke apart, the barn felt warmer despite the winter wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. "Stay for dinner," Silas said. "It wasn't a question. Only if you let me help cook. Your bachelor cooking is legendary in all the wrong ways. Insulting a man in his own barn, definitely dangerous." Margaret smiled, the expression lighting up the dim space. "You have no idea." As they walked toward the house together, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge, Sam Henley. His face still bruised from his encounter with the mud, his eyes dark with plans for revenge. The gossips of Mercy's Bend had been right about one thing. When ice begins to melt, the resulting flood can sweep away everything in its path. But inside the ranch house, as Margaret laughed at Silas's attempts to locate edible food in his bare pantry, as they worked side by side to create something resembling a meal, the warmth between them held the winter at bay. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, Sam Henley's plotting, the town's judgment, their own fears and doubts. Tonight, they had this: shared laughter in a warm kitchen, the simple pleasure of not being alone, and the fragile, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, two broken people could build something whole together. The accident happened 3 days later. Silas was riding the north boundary of his property, checking fence lines after a heavy snowfall, when his horse stepped into a hidden hole. The animal screamed, pitching forward, and Silas barely had time to kick free of the stirrups before they both went down hard. His head struck a buried rock, and the world exploded into stars before fading to black. He woke to gentle hands and a familiar voice tight with worry. "Don't move. You've got a nasty gash on your head, and I can't tell what else might be hurt." Silas blinked, trying to focus through the pain. Margaret's face swam into view, pale with concern. They were in a small room he recognized, Ben Harper's place, 2 miles from where he'd fallen. "How? Your horse came back without you, smart animal, went straight to my cabin. I knew something was wrong." She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "Ben helped me look. We found you half buried in snow." "Should have left me," Silas muttered. "Would have solved everyone's problems." Margaret's hand stilled. When she spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet. "If you ever say something that foolish again, I'll finish what that rock started." Despite the throbbing in his skull, Silas felt his lips twitch. "Violent woman. You have no idea." But her touch remained gentle as she continued tending his wound. "The doctor says you're lucky. No broken bones, just the head wound and some impressive bruises. You'll need to stay still for a few days." "Can't. Ranch. Ben and his sons are handling your stock, and before you argue, remember that you helped them through that harsh winter 3 years ago. People remember kindness. Silas, even if you prefer they didn't." He wanted to protest, but the effort made his head spin. Margaret's cool fingers smoothed his hair back from the bandage. And despite everything, the pain, the vulnerability, the fact that he was lying helpless while she cared for him, Silas felt something ease in his chest. Over the next days, as he recovered in Ben Harper's spare room, Margaret barely left his side. She read to him when the headaches made his own eyes hurt, forced him to eat the broth she prepared, and bullied him into staying still when he tried to get up too soon. "You're a terrible patient," she informed him on the third day, after he'd attempted to sneak out to check on his horse. "You're a bossy nurse," he countered, but he let her guide him back to bed. "Someone has to keep you from killing yourself with stubbornness." It was during those quiet hours, as snow fell steadily outside and the world shrunk to just the two of them, that Silas felt the last of his defenses crumble. Margaret told him stories of her childhood in Boston, of the dreams she'd had before life reshaped them. He found himself talking too, about Thomas, yes, but also about their parents, about the ranch in better days, about things he'd thought buried too deep to resurrect. "We were going to build a school," he said one evening, watching firelight play across Margaret's features. "Thomas and me, right here in Mercy's Bend, had it all planned out, where it would sit, what we'd teach. He was going to handle literature and history. I'd take mathematics and geography. What happened to those plans?" "They died with him." The words came out flat, matter of fact. "Couldn't see the point after. Who'd want their children learning from me anyway?" Margaret set aside the book she'd been reading aloud. "I would." "You don't have children." "No, but if I did, I'd want them taught by someone who understands that life isn't simple, who's survived loss and kept going, who knows the value of both strength and gentleness." She met his eyes steadily. "I'd want them taught by you." The conviction in her voice undid him. For the first time since Thomas's death, Silas wept, not the angry, bitter tears he'd shed in those first dark days, but something cleaner. Margaret held him without words, her presence a steady anchor as years of grief poured out. When the storm passed, leaving him emptied but somehow lighter, she was still there. "I love you," he said, the words rough but clear. "I fought it, denied it, tried to logic it away, but I love you, Margaret Whitley, and that terrifies me more than anything." She cupped his face in her hands, thumbs brushing away the last traces of tears. "I love you too, and yes, it's terrifying, but I'd rather be terrified with you than safe alone." They kissed then, soft and sure, a seal on words that changed everything. The next morning, Silas insisted on returning home. His head still ached, but the dizziness had passed. Margaret drove the wagon, handling the team with surprising skill. "Another hidden talent?" Silas asked. "My grandfather kept a delivery business. I spent summers helping him." She guided the horses around a rough patch. "Shocked my parents terribly. Proper young ladies didn't drive freight wagons. Proper young ladies didn't move to Wyoming alone either. Lucky for you. I've never been proper." They were still smiling when they reached his ranch and found the door standing open, snow drifting into the main room. Silas tensed, reaching for the rifle beneath the wagon seat. "Stay here," he ordered. But Margaret was already climbing down, her face set with determination. Together, they approached the house cautiously. The damage was thorough but targeted. Furniture overturned, dishes smashed, his few books torn apart and scattered. On the wall, written in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "Get out or burn." "Sam Henley," Margaret said quietly. "Probably. Can't prove it, though." Silas surveyed the destruction, his jaw tight. "This is what I was trying to spare you. This is what happens when bullies think they've won." Margaret began picking up the scattered pages of a book, one of Thomas's. Silas realized. Shakespeare's sonnets. "We'll clean it up. Make it right again. It's a warning. Next time we'll be ready." She faced him squarely. "I'm not running. Silas. Not from them. Not from this. Not from you." They spent the day putting the house to rights. Ben Harper and his sons appeared around noon, word having spread as it always did in small communities. They worked in relative silence, but their presence spoke volumes. Not everyone in Mercy's Bend stood with the Sam Henleys of the world. As evening fell and the helpers departed, Margaret and Silas stood in the restored main room. It looked almost normal, except for the message still scarred on the wall. "I'll paint over it tomorrow," Silas said. "No." Margaret traced the ugly words with one finger. "Leave it for now. Let them see their threats don't work." That night, She stayed, not in the spare room, not by the fire as he'd once done at her cabin, but with him. They came together with a desperate tenderness, aware of the fragility of what they'd found, determined to claim what joy they could in the face of uncertainty. Afterward, as they lay entwined in his narrow bed, Margaret traced the new scar on his temple. "If I'd lost you," she began, then stopped. "You didn't. But I could have. We could lose each other tomorrow, next week, 20 years from now. That's what loving someone means, accepting that loss is always possible." Silas caught her hand, pressed it to his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. "Then we'd better make the most of whatever time we get." "Yes," she agreed. "We'd better." They made love again, slower this time, mapping each other's scars and stories in the darkness. When dawn came, painting the mountains pink and gold, they rose to face it together. The reprieve lasted exactly 1 week. Silas had gone to town for supplies, leaving Margaret at the ranch despite her protests. She was working in the garden when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. Sam Henley led them, his uncle the banker beside him, along with 4 other men she recognized as some of the town's less savory elements. They stopped just outside the fence, but their intent was clear. "Morning, Mrs. Whitley," Sam called, his voice mock-pleasant. "Lovely day for a ride." Margaret straightened, keeping her face calm despite the fear threading through her veins. "Gentlemen, what can I do for you?" "Well now, that's the question, isn't it?" Sam dismounted, walking to the fence line. "See, we've been discussing your situation. A woman alone, so far from town, shacking up with a man who ain't her husband. It ain't proper. I wasn't aware my propriety was your concern. Everything in this valley is our concern." The banker, Henley Sr., remained mounted but his cold eyes fixed on her. "We're prepared to make you a generous offer for the Hadley place." "Enough to get you back east in comfort." "It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price." Sam said, "Question is, are you smart enough to take it before something unfortunate happens? Are you threatening me, Mr. Henley?" "Threatening?" Sam's smile was all teeth. "We're trying to help you, Mrs. Whitley. Accidents happen out here, fires start, stock goes missing. A woman alone might find it all too much to handle." "I'm not alone." "No? Where's your protector now?" Sam glanced around with exaggerated concern. "Seems to me you're very much alone." "She's not." The voice came from behind the barn. Ben Harper stepped into view, rifle cradled casually in his arms. His 3 sons followed, similarly armed. Then, from the other direction, came more neighbors, the Millers, the Johnsons, even old widow Chen who ran the laundry. "Afternoon, Sam," Ben said pleasantly. "Banker Henley. Funny thing, all of you being out here. Almost like you're planning something you shouldn't be." Sam's face darkened. "This ain't your business, Harper." "Well now, that's where you're wrong. Mrs. Whitley here is our neighbor. That makes her our business. Just like McCrae's our neighbor, whether some folks like it or not." "You'd stand with them?" Henley Sr.'s voice was cold. "That could be costly." "Maybe," Ben agreed. "But living with ourselves, if we didn't stand up, that'd cost more." The standoff stretched taut. 6 men facing a growing crowd of neighbors. Margaret watched, heart pounding as the power balance shifted. This wasn't just about her and Silas anymore. This was about what kind of place Mercy's Bend would be. Finally, Henley Sr. wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he warned. "Not by a long shot." The others followed, Sam casting one last venomous look at Margaret before mounting up. They thundered off in a cloud of dust and wounded pride. As soon as they were gone, Margaret's knees nearly buckled. "Mrs." Miller rushed to support her. "There now, dear, you did fine. Stood up to them like you belonged here." How did you all know to come?" "My youngest saw them riding out." Ben explained. "Figured they weren't heading this way for a social call." Word spread. "But why? Why risk their anger for us?" Old Widow Chen spoke up, her English accented but clear. 10 years ago, when my husband died, no one in town give me work. Say Chinese widow bad luck, Mr. McCrae. He hire me to do his washing. Never miss payment, never treat me bad. I remember. Silas helped us through the winter of 78, Mr. Miller added. Lost half-hour herd to cold. He shared his feed. Wouldn't take payment. Story after story emerged. Small kindnesses Silas had done over the years. Always quietly. Always brushing off thanks. The town might fear him. Might whisper about him. But beneath that ran a deeper current of respect. He's not the only reason we're here, Mrs. Johnson said, squeezing Margaret's hand. You've brought something back to him we thought was gone forever. Man's been dead inside for 10 years. You made him live again. That's worth protecting. Margaret blinked back tears. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Ben advised. Just keep doing what you're doing. And maybe, he grinned, maybe make an honest man of him before Banker Henley has a heart attack. The group dispersed with promises to keep watch, to be ready if the Henleys tried anything else. Margaret was gathering her courage to go inside when she saw Silas's wagon approaching at dangerous speed. He pulled up hard, leaping down before the wheels stopped rolling. Are you hurt? I heard in town, Henley and his men. I'm fine. She caught his hands, feeling them tremble. Ben and the others came. We're fine. Silas pulled her against him, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When I heard they'd come here, I thought, shh. She stroked his back, feeling the tension slowly ease. We're safe. We're together. That's all that matters. He pulled back to study her face, as if reassuring himself she was whole. This won't be the end of it. I know. They'll keep pushing until we push back harder. Margaret's chin lifted. I'm not giving up. Silas, not on this land, not on this life, and certainly not on you. He kissed her then, there in the yard where anyone could see, pouring all his fear and relief and love into the connection between them. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, his eyes held a new determination. Marry me, he said roughly. I know it's not romantic. I know it's born out of fear as much as love. But marry me. Let them see we're not hiding, not ashamed. Make this thing between us something even they can't deny. Margaret's answer was to pull him down for another kiss. This one soft and sure and full of promise. Full. Yes, she said against his lips. Yes, of course, yes. As they stood there in the gathering dusk, holding each other in the yard where threats had been made and faced down, Silas felt something fundamental shift. For 10 years he'd lived as if he were already dead, going through the motions but never truly engaging with life. Margaret had changed that. She'd brought light to his darkness, warmth to his winter, and most importantly, she'd reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. The Henleys would be back. The town gossips would whisper. Winter would bring its challenges and spring its own trials. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was this: the woman in his arms, the neighbors who'd stood for them, and the promise of a future that, while uncertain, was theirs to shape together. I love you, he murmured into her hair. I love you too. She replied, enough to face whatever comes. And standing there as the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, they both knew she meant it. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would weather them together. They had already survived the worst life could offer. Everything else was just details. The stranger arrived on the Tuesday stage, dressed in clothes too fine for Mercy's Bend and carrying himself with the casual arrogance of wealth. Word spread quickly through town. His name was Lawrence Garrison, cousin to the very family whose cattle had been the excuse for Thomas McCrae's death all those years ago. But this Garrison had been back east then, building a fortune in mining speculation. Now he'd returned, and his first stop was the bank. Silas heard about it from Ben Harper that evening. Says he's looking to buy land for a copper mine. Henley was practically licking his boots, showing him around like royalty. Let me guess, Silas said darkly. The land he wants includes my ranch. your ranch, the Hadley place, and everything between. Claims there's copper in those hills, worth a fortune if properly mined. Ben's expression was grim. Silas, this Garrison, he's the one who was with Thomas that night, before everything went wrong. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. What? My Mary remembered. She was working at the saloon then, before we married. Said this Garrison was drinking with Thomas, buying rounds, acting friendly. Then he disappeared right before the cattle went missing. Margaret, who'd been listening quietly, reached for Silas's hand. Could he have been involved? More than involved, Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. If he was setting Thomas up to take the blame. You need proof, Margaret said urgently. Real proof, not just suspicion. She's right, Ben agreed. Garrison's got money now. Influence. You can't just accuse him based on old memories. But Silas was already moving, heading for the trunk he kept in the bedroom. He returned with a leather journal, pages yellowed with age. Thomas's diary, he explained. I couldn't bear to read it after, but maybe now. They spent the next hours poring over Thomas's careful script. Most entries were mundane, notes about books read, observations about ranch life, dreams for the future. But as they neared the final entries, the tone changed. Met an interesting fellow today, Margaret read aloud. Lawrence Garrison, cousin to the big ranch family, says he's got plans for this territory, ways to make us all rich. Wants to talk more tomorrow night. The next entry was shorter. L. has strange ideas about progress. Says sometimes the old guard needs clearing out to make way for the new. Makes me uncomfortable. But he's buying drinks and seems to know everyone. Maybe I'm being too suspicious. The final entry, dated the night before the cattle disappeared, made them all freeze. Something's wrong. L.G. keeps asking about the Garrison cattle, their breeding stock, where they're kept. When I asked why, he laughed and said I worry too much. But I saw him talking to Jake Malone earlier. Everyone knows Jake's crooked as a snake. I think I should tell Silas, but he's in Cheyenne. Maybe I'll talk to the sheriff tomorrow. Maybe I'm wrong. God, I hope I'm wrong. Silas's hands shook as he closed the journal. He knew. Thomas knew something was off. This proves Garrison was involved. Margaret said, We need to take this to the authorities. What authorities? Silas laughed bitterly. The sheriff who did nothing when they strung Thomas up, the judge who's in Henley's pocket. The law's never been on our side, Margaret. Then we make them listen, she said fiercely. This journal, Mary Harper's testimony, it's enough to raise questions. Ben nodded slowly. There's something else. That rustler they caught a week after Thomas died. Jake Malone. He died in prison last year, but his widow still lives over in Cedar Ridge. Always claimed Jake was paid to steal those cattle, but nobody listened to a thief's wife. A plan began to form. It was risky, potentially dangerous, but for the first time in 10 years, Silas felt the possibility of real justice. The next morning, Margaret set out for Cedar Ridge while Silas and Ben made strategic visits around town. They had to be careful. If Garrison got wind of what they were doing, he'd have time to cover his tracks or discredit them. Margaret found Sally Malone living in poverty on the edge of Cedar Ridge, taking in washing to survive. The woman was suspicious at first, but when Margaret mentioned Thomas McCrae, her weathered face crumbled. That boy never stole nothing, Sally said. My Jake did plenty wrong, but that one thing ate at him. Said he was paid good money to cut that fence, steal them cattle. Supposed to be simple. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. Who paid him? Margaret asked gently. Some Eastern fellow. Smooth talker, fancy clothes. Jake never knew his name, but said he was related to the Garrison somehow. Wanted to stir up trouble, make the family look weak so he could buy them out cheap when he came back. Would you be willing to swear to this, to tell others what Jake told you? Sally's laugh was bitter. Who'd believe me? I'm just trash to folks like them. I believe you, Margaret said firmly. And others will too. If we stand together. She convinced Sally to return to Mercy's Bend with her, promising protection and a chance at justice. When they arrived, they found the town in an uproar. Garrison had made his move, publicly announcing his plans for a mining operation that would bring prosperity to the whole valley, starting with buying out the underutilized ranches in the hills. Of course, he'd added smoothly at the town meeting, "I'll pay fair prices. Though I'd hate for anyone to miss this opportunity by being stubborn. Mining can be dangerous work. Accidents happen. Fires start. Better to sell now while the offer's generous." The threat was clear, and most of the ranchers looked cowed. But when Silas stood up, journal in hand, the room went deadly quiet. "Interesting timing. Garrison," Silas said, "coming back now, after all these years. Tell me, do you remember a young man named Thomas McCrae?" Garrison's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw his hand tighten on his walking stick. "The name sounds familiar. Wasn't he the cattle thief from years back?" "He was my brother, and he was no thief." Silas opened the journal. "But you knew that, didn't you? You were with him the night before those cattle went missing, buying him drinks, asking questions about the Garrison herds. You're talking nonsense. McCrae, grief has clearly affected your mind." "Has it?" Ben Harper stood up. "Because my Mary remembers you that night too. Remembers you leaving right before the cattle disappeared." "And I—" Sally Malone stepped forward, voice shaking but determined. "Know who really stole them cattle? My late husband, Jake, and he was paid to do it by an Eastern man who wanted to cause trouble for the Garrison family." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Garrison's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "These are baseless accusations from unreliable sources. A grief-stricken brother, a saloon girl's memory, a thief's widow looking for attention. Then let's ask for a proper investigation," Margaret suggested, her clear voice cutting through the noise. "If Mr. Garrison has nothing to hide, surely he'd welcome the chance to clear his name." "An excellent idea," said a new voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Judge Stewart, the circuit judge who happened to be passing through. More importantly, he was one of the few legal authorities not in Henley's pocket. "In fact, I insist on it. These are serious allegations. Mr. Garrison, the territorial marshal, will want to look into them." Garrison's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. You'd take the word of these nobodies over mine?" "I'd take the word of evidence over anyone's." Judge Stewart replied mildly. "That journal, for instance, I'd very much like to examine it. And Mrs. Malone, I'll need your full statement about what your husband told you." "You can't," Garrison started, then seemed to realize his protest was only making him look guilty. "This is a waste of time. I have business elsewhere." He tried to leave, but found his way blocked by several ranchers. Not threatening, just present. The same men who'd been cowed by his threats moments before now stood firm, bolstered by the possibility of truth finally coming to light. "Sit down. Mr. Garrison," Judge Stewart ordered. "We're just getting started." What followed was 3 hours of testimony. Sally Malone told her story, producing a letter Jake had written her from prison, confessing his part and naming the Eastern gentleman who'd paid him. Mary Harper testified about that night in the saloon. Silas read from Thomas's journal, his voice steady despite the tears tracking down his face. Then, unexpectedly, old Samuel Garrett stood up. "I got something to say. 10 years ago, I was part of the group that went after the McCrae boy. I ain't proud of it. Garrison's cousin, he's the one who worked us up. Kept saying how we couldn't let thieves run wild, how we had to act before the law failed us. Looking back, seems mighty convenient he had us do his dirty work." One by one, others came forward, men who'd been part of the mob, carrying guilt for a decade, finally unburdening themselves. The truth emerged in pieces. How Lawrence Garrison had orchestrated the theft to disgrace his cousins and position himself to buy their land cheap when he returned. How Thomas's murder, while not directly planned, had been a convenient result that silenced the one person who might have exposed the scheme. Through it all, Garrison sat rigid, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Finally, as the evidence mounted, he cracked. "You don't understand," he burst out. "This territory is wasted on cattle and small thinking. I could have made something of it, brought industry, progress, built on the blood of an innocent man," Silas said quietly. The judge had heard enough. "Lawrence Garrison, I'm placing you under arrest pending a full investigation by the territorial authorities. The charges will include conspiracy, theft, and potentially murder." As the sheriff, looking uncomfortable but unable to refuse a judge's direct order, led Garrison away, the courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others wept. Many simply sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Silas stood frozen as neighbors approached, men who'd shunned him for years, now offering handshakes and apologies. He accepted them numbly, his mind struggling to process that after 10 years, Thomas would finally have justice. Margaret appeared at his elbow, guiding him outside where the air was cleaner. They stood on the courthouse steps, watching as Garrison was loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial capital. "It's not over," she warned gently. "There'll be a trial, and Garrison has money for good lawyers." "I know, but it's a start." He turned to her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thomas can rest easier now. And you," she touched his face gently. "Can you rest easier?" "I don't know," he admitted. "For so long, anger was all I had. Without it, you have room for other things, better things." She smiled, though tears stood in her own eyes. "You have a life to live, Silas, the life Thomas would have wanted for you." They were interrupted by Ben Harper and the others, full of plans for ensuring the truth reached the territorial newspapers, that Garrison couldn't buy his way free. But Silas found his attention drifting to Margaret, to the way the afternoon sun caught in her hair, to the fierce protectiveness in her eyes when she looked at him. His brother was gone. Nothing could change that, but Thomas had written in his journal about dreams and futures and the importance of hope. Maybe, Silas thought, it was time to honor those words by living them. As the crowd dispersed and plans were made, Silas caught Margaret's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? For not letting me give up. For fighting when I'd forgotten how. For seeing something in me worth saving." She squeezed his fingers. "You saved yourself. Silas, I just reminded you it was possible." Later, back at the ranch, they sat together on the porch despite the cold, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The house still bore the scars of the Henleys' vandalism. The town still whispered about them, and the future remained uncertain. But for the first time in a decade, Silas felt something like peace. Not the numbness he'd mistaken for peace all those years, but real quietude of spirit. Thomas was gone, but his truth had been heard. Justice, imperfect and delayed, was finally in motion. "He would have liked you," Silas said suddenly. "Thomas, he would have admired your courage, your refusal to let injustice stand. I would have liked him too." Margaret replied, "Anyone who could inspire such loyalty, such love, he must have been extraordinary." "He was, and he'd have wanted—" Silas paused, then forged ahead. "He'd have wanted me to be happy, to live fully, not just exist." "Then let's do that," Margaret said. "Let's live fully, together." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they went inside together, leaving the ghosts on the porch. There would still be battles to fight, wounds to heal, a life to build from the ashes of old pain. But they would face it all together, and that made all the difference. In the journal Silas had kept locked away, Thomas had written about the importance of hope, about how even in the darkest winter, spring eventually comes. Sitting by the fire with Margaret, planning their future while the past finally loosened its grip, Silas understood what his brother had meant. Winter was ending. Spring was coming, and they would be ready for it. The trial became the talk of the territory. Newspapers from Denver to San Francisco picked up the story. The decade-old injustice. The wealthy schemer brought low. The love story that had helped uncover the truth. Reporters descended on Mercy's Bend like locusts, hungry for every detail. The Widow and the Rancher, a tale of love and justice. Margaret read from one particularly sensational headline, her voice dry with amusement. They make us sound like characters from a dime novel. Let them write what they want, Silas said. Focused on repairing a harness, long as the truth about Thomas gets told. But the attention had unexpected consequences. Letters poured in from across the West, people who'd faced similar injustices, families torn apart by false accusations, communities where the wealthy had trampled the poor. Many wrote to thank them for standing up, for proving that sometimes the truth could prevail. One letter stood out. It came from a lawyer in Denver, representing a group of investors interested in ethical development of the territory. "We've been following your case with great interest," Margaret read. "The courage you've shown in standing against corruption has impressed us deeply. We'd like to discuss the possibility of funding a school in Mercy's Bend, one dedicated to your brother's memory." Silas set down his tools, hands suddenly unsteady. "A school? The Thomas McCrae School for Practical Learning." Margaret continued. "They want to fund construction in the first 5 years of operation. They're particularly interested in your idea of combining academic study with practical skills, exactly what you and Thomas had planned." For a long moment, Silas couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotion. Thomas would have loved this. "You'll do it?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "We'll do it," he corrected. "You and me, the way it should be done." The trial itself, held in the territorial capital, was both triumph and ordeal. Lawrence Garrison had indeed hired expensive lawyers who tried every trick to discredit the witnesses. But the evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment had turned decisively against him. Margaret testified with quiet dignity about finding Sally Malone, about the fear in the woman's eyes as she spoke her truth. Silas read from Thomas's journal, his voice steady even as the gallery wept. One by one, the men who'd participated in the lynching came forward, many for the first time publicly admitting their role. "I've carried this guilt for 10 years, Samuel Garrett said, hat literally in hand. "Garrison played us like fiddles, wound us up and pointed us at an innocent boy. That's on us. We chose to act, but the truth needs telling." The most dramatic moment came when Garrison himself took the stand, cornered by evidence and abandoned by his wealthy cousins, who wanted no association with the scandal. He finally broke. "You have to understand the vision I had," he said, his smooth facade cracking. "This territory could be so much more than cattle and stubborn ranchers. I saw cities, industry, progress." "Built on murder?" the prosecutor interrupted. "I never meant for the boy to die," Garrison burst out. "It was supposed to be simple. Discredit the family. Buy the land cheap. The lynching was an unfortunate complication." The gallery erupted at this casual dismissal of Thomas's death as a complication. The judge had to call for order multiple times. In the end, the verdict was swift: guilty of conspiracy, theft, and incitement to murder. The sentence, 25 years hard labor, brought no joy to Silas, only a sense of completion. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But it was what happened after the trial that truly marked the change in Mercy's Bend. They returned to find the town transformed. The guilty verdict had forced a reckoning, not just with Garrison's crimes, but with the community's role in enabling them. Reverend Davidson led the charge, organizing meetings where people could speak their truths and seek forgiveness. "We failed you," Mayor Phillips said at one such gathering, addressing Silas directly. "We failed Thomas, and we failed ourselves. Let us try to make it right." What followed was an outpouring of support that stunned both Silas and Margaret. Ranchers volunteered labor for the school construction. Women organized fundraisers. Even banker Henley, his power broken by his association with Garrison, contributed funds, though whether from genuine remorse or calculated self-interest, none could say. The site chosen for the school was a piece of land overlooking the valley, where students could see both the town and the vast wilderness beyond. a reminder that education should prepare them for both. It's perfect, Margaret said, standing beside Silas as they surveyed the construction. Thomas would have loved this spot. He always said you could think clearer up high. Silas agreed, said it gave you perspective. As spring arrived in full glory, melting the last of the snow and bringing wildflowers to the meadows, other changes bloomed as well. Silas and Margaret were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Ben Harper standing as witness and half the town in attendance. Even Mrs. Patterson, chief among the former gossips, brought a wedding quilt. "I misjudged you," she said to Margaret, the words clearly difficult. "Both of you, I hope you'll accept this as an apology." The quilt was beautiful, each square crafted by a different woman in town, telling the story of the valley in fabric and thread. Margaret accepted it with tears in her eyes, understanding the gesture for what it was, not just an apology, but an acceptance. She belonged here now. The wedding celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more laughter than the ranch had heard in over a decade. Silas found himself swept into dance after dance. Neighbors who'd once crossed streets to avoid him now clapping him on the back and wishing him well. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" Margaret said during a brief respite, bringing him a cup of punch. That's one word for it. He pulled her close, marveling again at how perfectly she fit in his arms. "You know what's strange? I spent so many years hating them all, but now you see them as they are, flawed, frightened people who made terrible choices but are trying to be better. When did you get so wise, Mrs. McCrae?" "Oh, about the time I fell in love with a stubborn rancher who taught me that forgiveness isn't weakness." She smiled up at him. "It's the hardest kind of strength there is." The Thomas McCrae School opened that fall with 25 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Silas taught mathematics and geography as he'd once dreamed, while Margaret handled literature and writing. They hired Miss Emily Carson, fresh from Teachers College, to cover history and sciences. On the first day, Silas stood before the class, Thomas's journal on the desk beside him. "My brother believed education was the key to everything," he began, voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "He said it didn't matter where you came from or what your parents did. If you could read and think and question, you could make your own path. This school is his dream made real. I hope you'll honor that by making the most of what we offer here." The students, children of ranchers and shopkeepers, including 2 Chinese children Widow Chen had taken in, listened with solemn attention. Education was still a luxury in the territory, and they knew they were being given something precious. Among the students was Jake Morrison, the store owner's son who'd once taunted Silas. He'd asked to attend, approaching Silas with genuine humility. "I was wrong about you, Mr. McCrae. About a lot of things. I'd like to learn better, if you'll have me." It would have been easy to refuse, to hold on to that old anger. But Margaret's hand on his arm reminded Silas that the school was about second chances, about breaking cycles of ignorance and prejudice. "Everyone's welcome here," he'd said, "long as they're willing to learn." The school thrived beyond their wildest hopes. Students came from neighboring towns, some boarding with families in Mercy's Bend for the chance at education. The combination of academic and practical learning proved popular. Students learned Shakespeare and soil management, algebra and animal husbandry, history and how to build a barn that would withstand winter storms. Margaret started a small library, filling it with donated books and those purchased with fundraiser proceeds. She taught evening classes for adults who'd never learned to read, patiently guiding weathered hands through the shapes of letters. One evening, as winter approached again, Silas found her there teaching Sally Malone. Jake's widow had moved to Mercy's Bend and found work at the school as a cook. "That's right," Margaret encouraged as Sally slowly sounded out words. "Take your time. Every reader starts somewhere." Watching them, Silas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove heating the room. This was what Thomas had envisioned, Not just a building where facts were memorized, but a place where lives were transformed. Later, walking home through the first snowfall of the season, Margaret tucked her arm through his. "No regrets?" she asked. "You could have had a quiet life, just you and your cattle. I had that for 10 years. Silas replied, "Turns out quiet and empty sound a lot alike." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "You gave me back my life. Margaret, you and this whole impossible journey. We gave each other back our lives," she corrected. "That's what love does. It makes us brave enough to live again." The snow fell softly around them, blanketing the world in pristine white. In the distance, the school stood proud on its hill, windows dark now but ready to glow with light and learning come morning. Below, in the valley, Mercy's Bend settled in for the night, a town wrestling with its past but facing its future with newfound courage. "You know what today is?" Margaret asked suddenly. Silas thought, "November 15th. 1 year since I arrived on the stage. 1 year since I stood in that drafty cabin, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. Best year of my life." Silas said simply, "Even with everything, the threats, the trial, all of it, still the best year." "Mine too." She reached up to brush snow from his hair. "Though I have a feeling the next ones will be even better." As they continued home, Silas thought about cycles, how a town's cruelty had created his isolation, how his isolation had been broken by Margaret's courage, how their love had helped reveal old truths, how those truths had transformed the community. It wasn't a straight line from pain to healing, but perhaps that's not how healing worked. Perhaps it was more like the seasons, winter to spring to summer to fall and back again, each cycle carrying the seeds of the next. In his pocket, he carried a letter that had arrived that day. It was from a group of Thomas's old friends from his brief time at college, men who'd gone on to become teachers and lawyers and doctors. They wanted to establish a scholarship fund in Thomas's name to help promising students from the territory attend university. He'd show it to Margaret later, plan how to announce it to the school. But for now, he simply walked with his wife through the falling snow, marveling at how love could take the worst tragedy of your life and transform it into something that honored the dead while serving the living. Thomas was gone. That would never change, never stop hurting. But his dream lived on in every child who learned to read in that schoolhouse, every adult who discovered they weren't too old to start over, every act of courage that chose forgiveness over fear. "Thank you, little brother," Silas whispered to the snowy sky, "for dreaming big enough for both of us." Margaret squeezed his arm, understanding without words. Together they walked on through the peaceful night, toward the warm light of home, carrying their ghosts gently and their love fiercely, ready for whatever came next. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow from the mountains and filling the streams with rushing water. The Thomas McCrae School had just celebrated its first successful term, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across the valley like birdsong. Margaret stood in the doorway of their new home, built beside the old ranch house with the help of neighbors, watching Silas work with a young student in the garden they'd planted behind the school. "See here, Jimmy," Silas explained patiently. "You plant the seeds when the soil feels like this, not too wet, not too dry. Your hands will learn to know the difference." The boy, son of one of the men who'd participated in the mob years ago, listened with rapt attention. It was moments like these that still took Margaret's breath away. The man who'd once been known as the heartless rancher now had children following him like ducklings, eager for his approval and guidance. "Mrs. McCrae," Emily Carson called from the schoolhouse. "The photographer from Denver is here." They'd arranged for a formal photograph to commemorate the school's success, something to send to the investors and to keep for posterity. As Margaret helped organize the students and teachers, she noticed Silas hanging back. "You too, Mr. McCrae," the photographer insisted. "Can't have a picture of the Thomas McCrae School without a McCrae in it." Reluctantly, Silas took his place beside Margaret, his hand finding hers as the photographer prepared his equipment. In that moment, standing before the school his brother had dreamed of, surrounded by the community that had once shunned him. Silas felt the last of his old bitterness fade away like morning mist. The photograph would show a simple scene: teachers and students arranged on the schoolhouse steps, mountains rising majestically behind them. But those who looked closely could see more: the way the students gazed at their teachers with trust and admiration, the pride in Margaret's bearing, the peace that had finally settled over Silas's weathered features. After the photographer left, Margaret found Silas in the small room they'd designated as Thomas's memorial library. He stood before the portrait they'd commissioned from a traveling artist, based on an old tintype. Thomas at 20, full of dreams and determination. He'd be so proud, Margaret said softly, joining him. I was thinking, Silas said, about something he wrote once. Education isn't just about filling heads with facts. It's about teaching people to see possibility where others see only limitation. He smiled slightly. Took me 10 years to understand what he meant. You understand now. That's what matters. They were interrupted by Sally Malone, who'd become indispensable as both cook and unofficial mother hen to the boarding students. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but there's a rider coming. Looks like he's carrying official papers. The rider brought news that would reshape their future once again. The territorial government, impressed by the school's success and the transformation of Mercy's Bend, wanted to establish it as a model for rural education. They offered funding to expand, to train teachers who could start similar schools throughout Wyoming. Think of it, Margaret breathed as they read through the proposal. Not just one school, but a network. Thomas's dream spreading across the whole territory. It's a big responsibility, Silas warned, but his eyes were bright with possibility. When has that ever stopped us? The expansion meant changes. They hired more teachers, built dormitories for students from distant ranches, added workshops for practical skills. Silas found himself traveling to other communities, helping establish sister schools, while Margaret developed curriculum that balanced academic excellence with frontier practicality. One evening, returning from such a trip, Silas found Margaret in their garden, tending the herbs she'd started growing for both cooking and medicine. The setting sun painted everything golden, and for a moment, he just stood watching her, this woman who'd arrived in a threadbare dress and transformed not just his life, but an entire town. You're staring, she said without looking up. Can't help it. Still can't believe you're real sometimes. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and he saw she'd been crying. What's wrong? He was beside her instantly. Nothing's wrong. She smiled through her tears, taking his hands. Everything's right. That's why I'm crying. I'm just so happy it hurts. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. He pulled her close, understanding completely. Joy could be as overwhelming as grief, especially when you'd thought yourself incapable of feeling it again. I was thinking, she said against his chest, about that first winter, how cold everything was. Not just the weather, but us, the town, everything frozen and brittle. And now it's spring, real spring, not just the season, new growth everywhere. She pulled back to look at him. I have something to tell you. The way she said it, half nervous, half elated, made his heart skip. Margaret? I saw Doc Morrison yesterday. Silas, we're going to have a baby. The world seemed to stop. Silas stared at her, unable to process the words. They'd never spoken of children, both carrying too much loss to dare hope for such a gift. A baby, he repeated stupidly. Are you happy? Her voice was uncertain now. I know we never discussed. He kissed her, pouring every ounce of joy and wonder and terror and love into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, he managed. Margaret, a baby. Our baby. Due in autumn, she confirmed. Around harvest time. They stood in their garden as twilight deepened, holding each other and marveling at this unexpected blessing. Above them, the first stars appeared, and Silas found himself thinking of Thomas again, how his brother had always said that life found a way to balance the scales. That joy followed sorrow as surely as spring followed winter. The news of the coming baby spread through Mercy's Bend like wildfire. The women who'd once snubbed Margaret now showered her with advice and hand-sewn baby clothes. Even crusty old ranchers stopped Silas to offer congratulations and their own awkward wisdom about fatherhood. As summer progressed and Margaret's condition became obvious, she continued teaching until Doc Morrison ordered her to rest. She compromised by holding smaller classes at home, unable to fully step away from the students she'd come to love. Silas, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing for their child with the same intensity he'd once reserved for isolation. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth as silk. He read every book on child-rearing the library could order, driving Margaret to fond exasperation with his worried questions. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him one evening as he fretted over her tired spell. "Not my woman, not my baby." She touched his face gently. "We're going to be fine, all three of us, I promise." The baby, a daughter, arrived with the first frost of autumn, as if she'd waited for the harvest to be complete before making her entrance. The birth was long but uncomplicated, with Doc Morrison and Widow Chen attending. When Silas finally held his daughter, her tiny weight in his arms made him tremble. "She's perfect," he whispered, awed. "Look at her, Margaret. She's perfect." "What should we call her?" Margaret asked, exhausted but radiant. Silas looked at the baby's wise little face, the shock of dark hair, the tiny fingers that gripped his with surprising strength. "Elizabeth," he said. "Elizabeth Rose McCrae. After the daughter you lost, if that's not too painful." Margaret's tears flowed freely. "It's perfect, a way to honor the past while celebrating the future." Elizabeth grew surrounded by love, not just from her parents, but from an entire community that had learned the cost of cruelty and the value of redemption. She took her first steps in the schoolhouse, said her first words, "book," to Margaret's delight, and grew up believing that education and compassion were as natural as breathing. One spring day when Elizabeth was 4, they made their annual visit to Thomas's grave. The cemetery had grown prettier over the years, with trees planted and paths maintained. Thomas's headstone stood clean and dignified, regularly decorated with fresh flowers from anonymous townspeople. "Uncle Thomas," Elizabeth said seriously, placing her small bouquet of wildflowers. "Mama says you would have loved me." "He would have," Silas confirmed, kneeling beside his daughter. "He would have taught you all about books and ideas and dreams. But you teach me those things." "I do, because he taught me first." As they walked back through town, Elizabeth between them, hands swinging, Margaret said, "Do you ever think about how different life would be if none of it had happened? If Thomas had lived? If I'd never come west?" Silas considered. "I used to. Spent years wishing I could change that night, but now—" He looked at his daughter, at his wife, at the school on the hill that bore his brother's name. "Now I think maybe things happen the way they need to." The pain was real. The loss was real. But so is this, so is she. Elizabeth, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, began singing a song she'd learned at school, her voice bright and clear in the spring air. Around them. Mercy's Bend went about its business, a town that had faced its darkness and chosen to build something better from the ashes. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Silas pulled out a letter he'd been saving. "What's this?" Margaret asked. "From the Territorial Board of Education. They want to name the teaching methodology we developed the McCrae-Whitley method. Want us to write a book about it, train teachers across the West." Margaret laughed, the sound still capable of warming his heart after all these years. "From the rancher who wouldn't speak to anyone and the widow who burned water. We've come a long way." "Together," he agreed, catching her hand. "We've come a long way together." Elizabeth climbed into Silas's lap, yawning widely. "Tell me the story, Papa, about the lonely rancher and the laughing lady." It had become her favorite bedtime story, sanitized for young ears but true in its essence. The story of two broken people who found each other, who chose love over fear, who built something beautiful from the ruins of their pain. As Silas began the familiar tale, Margaret leaning against his shoulder, Elizabeth's eyes growing heavy, he marveled again at the journey that had brought them here. The lonely rancher was lonely no more. The widow's laughter filled their home daily. And somewhere, surely, Thomas smiled to see his dreams made manifest in ways he'd never imagined. "You didn't just make me laugh," Silas murmured to Margaret as Elizabeth finally dozed off. "You taught me to live again." "We taught each other," she corrected, as she always did. "That's what love does." The stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. The same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their struggles, their triumphs. Below them, the valley settled into peaceful night, the school on the hill standing ready for tomorrow's lessons, tomorrow's possibilities. In the house built by community, in the family forged by choice, in the love that had conquered both grief and gossip. Silas McCrae finally understood the truth his brother had always known, that life, for all its pain, was unutterably precious. That spring always followed winter, that sometimes the greatest gift was simply the courage to begin again. Margaret's laughter drifted on the evening breeze, mixing with their daughter's sleepy giggles as they carried her to bed. And in that sound, the sound that had first cracked his frozen heart, was all the proof anyone needed that love, patient and persistent, could indeed work miracles. The heartless rancher and the eastern widow had written their own story, and it was more beautiful than any gossip could have imagined. It was a story of loss transformed into purpose, isolation transformed into community, and two souls who'd thought themselves beyond saving, discovering that together they could save each other. As the moon rose over the mountains, bathing the valley in silver light, all was well in Mercy's Bend. The past was honored, the present was cherished, and the future stretched ahead full of promise. And in a modest ranch house where laughter came easy and love ran deep, a family that shouldn't have been possible settled in for another peaceful night, grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought them home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Silas and Margaret's journey. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more stories of love, redemption, and the untamed American frontier.